Are we good? Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to WaterAid, and welcome to this event, Realising Safely Managed Urban Sanitation, the Potential of Brown Gold. We're in, I see, the Blue Nile, White Nile room at WaterAid. So those of you in the middle are approximately in Khartoum, I've estimated. It's my pleasure to chair this event. I am with the International Water Management Institute. My name is Alan Nicol. And the most important announcement I have to make, this is an event about sanitation, is that the toilets are out towards the reception area on the right-hand side. That's the most important announcement. So I welcome you all to this seminar. We have an hour and a half, or just under an hour and a half. I welcome all our online participants as well. I know that there are at least 30 people online, about 30 people in the room. So we're reaching a good number. It's also a really important day. I don't know how many of you know, but tomorrow is the kickoff of the UN Summit of the Future in New York City. And that's a summit that is really going to be looking at progress towards the SDGs and understanding what can be done better in going forward. Now, I feel this meeting is incredibly timely by accident or design, I'm not quite sure, but it's very timely because it can send a very strong message to the delegates at that summit, heads of state, heads of UN organizations, all sorts of international development dignitaries, if you like. It can send a very strong message that sanitation is behind, and there are many challenges associated with that lack of progress. There are very good spots around the world where there has been amazing progress, but there's still an awful lot to do. So this meeting is extremely timely, and it can send that strong message about doing more, doing it quickly, and doing it sustainably and equitably. But it can also send a really important message about doing it differently. And I think that, for me at least, having read this brief, which is the reason we're all here, the launch of this very important brief and the recommendations in this brief, it can send a strong message about doing it differently because it's been based on several years of very deep research in 4 countries, 2 in Africa, Ghana and Ethiopia, and 2 in South Asia, Nepal and India. And those country case studies demonstrate some of the incredible opportunities for doing it differently and doing it better and doing it more sustainably, but crucially, doing it more equitably. So I want to invite you again to this seminar, and I want to introduce this amazing panel we have here of incredibly expert opinion and expert researchers, expert practitioners together in the room. We have Laila Mehta, who is a professorial fellow at IDS and a visiting professor at Noragrik, the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. She trained as a sociologist and has a PhD in development studies from Vienna, I believe. Her work focuses on issues including water and sanitation, climate change, rights, resource grabbing, the politics of sustainability, crucially, and scarcity and uncertainty. But most of all, she's the intellectual driving force behind Brown Gold and is indeed the leader of the project. We also have Andreas Gueso from WaterAid. Andreas drives WaterAid's global policy and advocacy agenda on sanitation, correct? Right there in the thick of it all. He's a cross-disciplinary expert, combining an engineering background and 8 years as a development scholar. So the engineering, the doing, the delivery, as well as the understanding of context. Having conducted research in different countries across South America, Asia, and Africa, he's been working on sanitation since 2009, including completing a PhD on Indian sanitation policies and the sustainability of CLTS, community-led total sanitation, a critical topic. We also have with us Mariam Zaqout, who's at the Bartlett School at University College London. Mariam is a research fellow and an interdisciplinary researcher. Her work focuses on improving access to water and sanitation in low and middle income countries. And in 2023, when she joined, firstly, the Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose as part of the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, she worked very closely with Professor Mariam Mazzucato, who, as we know, is very much evolving the idea of mission-driven development and changing things through very focused development activities. Her PhD, Mariam's PhD, was on water sanitation and health engineering at the University of Leeds. And it looked at the political economy of sanitation and stakeholder incentives. And those of you that have read this report and have looked at the recommendations will see that the politics of change is absolutely central to the debate and indeed the kind of discourse we'll enter into today. We're also privileged to have Paul Deverell, who is Senior Wash Advisor, the Senior Wash Advisor?
I won't answer that question until after this meeting.
At FCDO, with 3 decades of experience in South Asia and Africa on water sanitation and hygiene service delivery for government, for NGOs and the private sector. So he brings a huge amount of operational experience, policy development experience and strategic thinking, including in his position, which is of course now part of a very important new thinking in the development sector under a new government. We also have with us, finally, but certainly not least, Sam from WASUP, the Water and Sanitation for Urban Poor, which is a not-for-profit organization. His current role is Director of Research and Learning. And Sam has worked in a number of research roles before WASUP at different organizations. He brings a wealth of knowledge from urban sanitation delivery contexts around the world. So that's my introduction. I now want to turn over to Lila and to Andreas to kick us off with a deep, insightful view of the project, the recommendations, and how you got us here.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Alan. Hello, everybody. It's great to be here, and many thanks to Andreas and colleagues at WaterAid for hosting us here today. It's a great opportunity to share findings from the Towards Brown Gold project and also discuss implications for policy and practice, and especially realizing SDG 6. Just upfront, this project is funded by UKRI, GCRF, and we've had a wonderful partnership with colleagues in 4 countries, so in Ethiopia, Ghana, India, and Nepal. And when I look back, this has been a very unique project. We started in 2020, and it's characterized by 6 C's. So the first C is COVID. Basically, COVID hit just as we were kicking off. Second is conflict and war, which hit the site in Mekelle. Our colleague Kifle can't be here. I hope he's online because of passport issues. And for 1.5 years, we had no contact with him. Of course, climate disruption, which is affecting all of us, and the cuts. So within 6 months, we had cuts and we had to, the UK government cuts. So then we had to change things. But despite all the challenges, I think we did a lot and with huge impacts on the ground. And I think that's largely because of companionship, camaraderie, and also care in the consortium. So care within the group, but also I think a sense of care and duty to people who are basically living in shit, working with shit, and are condemned to do so, and that's been the case. So our challenge is the off-grid challenge. And as we know, towns and cities are growing rapidly, and these areas are disconnected from the centralized systems and are likely to stay like that for a while. It's unrealistic to expect centralized systems like we have with Thames Water, Southern Water, etc. We went to Southern Water yesterday, which was also interesting. And toilet coverage has increased rapidly around the world through these big sanitation drives, but there's a lot that's missing. So that's what we're focusing on this project, the 2nd and 3rd generation challenges of sanitation, questions of sustainability, marginality, equity, and also the potential of the circular economy. Slide. Oh yeah, so when you see that, toilets have gone all around the world, especially in urban areas. We see toilets everywhere. Of course, there's still open defecation challenges. But the question is, where does the shit go? Where does the wastewater go? Especially in challenging areas, in areas that are disconnected, areas where topography is difficult, etc. And areas where we have residents such as migrants, scavengers, low caste, slum dwellers, etc. These people are denied their basic rights, and these are violated on a daily basis. So in a way, we're interested in finding out, we were looking at these invisible flows, invisible people, people who don't count, people who are marginalized, and then also the invisible flows of pathogen. But in a way, fecal sludge is very rich in nutrients. There's a lot of potential. So the question was, can this actually become brown gold, which is kind of the safe reuse of shit or wastewater that unlocks its potential as a resource? So this was when we started. But when we were doing the research, we saw and so many challenges along the way. So really, it's going to be a long while before we can actually realize some of these ideals of the circular economy innovation. For example, this whole focus on technology, on quick fix, on profitability. In a way, there are so many socio-political challenges and implications and institutional challenges that also need to be addressed. In this project, we used an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary lens. So we got together academics, but also practitioners. So in a way, the first 2 years in lockdown on Zoom were about getting to know each other in lockdown on Zoom and really trying to break down these disparate divides. And also, you know, just where we were all coming from. So we have social scientists looking at questions of access, inequality, marginality, power, also diverse perceptions of wastewater and institutional and policy elements. We have natural scientists, and it's been great to work together to look at the robustness of the sanitation chain, to monitor shit flows, contamination in the wastewater. And finally, we also have a creative and inclusive arts component. So performative interventions around looking at the invisible aspects of fecal sludge, looking at marginality of sanitation work, and also facilitating difficult conversations that wouldn't be possible just through unconventional formats. Last slide from me. So we worked in these different cities and sites. So Tigray, as I said, where, you know, there was this horrible war, but still, you know, there was potential from below, and we'll hear about that. Ghana, in Nepal, Gularia, but we also had arts installation in Lumbini. And then we worked in India, in Nanded, Maharashtra, and Alleppey. But Andres will talk a little more about some of the key findings and also the implications for policy and practice. Thanks.
Thank you. No, so in terms of I'll just cover some of the findings and the key findings and briefly the recommendations. And wanted to start with the finding about the challenges to the circular sanitation economy and to the narrative around circular sanitation economy. So I think this is the most useful contribution when you look at all the sites. I think that was emerging more clearly, and that it's I mean, there are lots of contributions in each of the sites of some of the findings, but when you look at it at the global level, I think the documentation of some of these challenges in practice across contexts, I think that's an important aspect that this project is bringing. And I think most of the sites, they were, and some of the pictures also highlight, there was experience of reusing fecal waste, but I think it's less glamorous than what you think of when you hear about the circular sanitation economy and people getting a lot of economic benefit from that. So it's more like a low profile, very often unsafe, just dumping fecal waste on agriculture, not very clear necessarily return from it. And the other element that we could see is that a lot of these examples are at a very small scale. So a big gap between these ideas of the circular sanitation economy and the actual practice currently of reuse. And the thing that was emerging also across the sites was that for that potential to be realized, we have to address things like the poor conditions of existing sanitation infrastructure. That means that it's not so easy to get the fecal waste and reuse it. There are aspects around the unsupportive policies and the wrong incentives, also cultural perceptions of waste, and a lack of cross-sectoral collaboration. And also this narrative that is over-promising the benefits of the circular sanitation economy can be counterproductive, because then it's like, oh, well, it's not as nice as I was told. So it creates unrealistic expectations. Another key finding that Laila also mentioned was that we are looking at reuse and so on, but then in a lot of these sites, we see very low access to safely managed sanitation and also some open defecation. So there's a bit of disconnection between the reality in these sites and this aspiration to the circular sanitation economy. And in addition to this low access, there was also evidence of very poor working conditions and discrimination for sanitation workers, who are the ones that in theory have to make this happen by moving and getting the waste treated. The third finding is around inequalities and exclusion, because we saw that progress is particularly low among groups marginalized due to caste, gender, migration history, class, also war-affected areas. And particularly when these elements intersect, you can see very poor conditions. And they often intersect in informal areas, in these rapidly expanding urban areas. They tend to have low coverage, but they are also disproportionately underfunded because a lot of the resources are skewed towards the formal areas and where the better off live. There's also more uplifting findings when we look at the action that communities are taking, and they were in several of the sites using their voice and power to demand better sanitation services from authorities and service providers, but also to improve the working conditions for sanitation workers. And then finally, policy gaps. So key problem is that the role of off-grid or on-site sanitation, so where the toilets are connected to pits and septic tanks rather than sewer. These type of sanitation systems are not properly recognized in policy, regulation, and financing. So we see then that there are unclear roles and responsibilities when it comes to safely managed sanitation, also very limited capacity. And again, that when you look at financing, capital-intensive sanitation infrastructure that serves bigger cities are getting most of the resources, and there's very little left for on-site sanitation, which again is fueling those inequalities that we highlighted between the formal and the informal. So yeah, that's a quick tour of the findings, but you have the policy brief if you want more details, and also the case studies. And I'm going to cover the recommendations even more briefly, so we have time for discussions. But we have 6 recommendations coming from the policy brief. The first one is the need to make safely managed sanitation services in small towns and cities a political priority. That's about policies, strategies, regulation, fundings, so really embrace the idea of safely managed sanitation and also put equality front and center. Second one is to facilitate comprehensive and inclusive sanitation planning, bringing this multidisciplinary perspective that the project has also illustrated, also involving communities, particularly those most marginalized and poor. Third recommendation is to protect the rights of sanitation workers. And I think this is a moral imperative, but also a pragmatic imperative, because you cannot have those that are operating this circular sanitation economy dying every other day because of the risk of their work, or leaving the sector because it's really not a good employment option. So this around fair wages, social security, safety at work, dignity, also self-organization of the workers. Fourth recommendation is to be realistic when promoting the sanitation circular economy. So how I highlighted the need to stop overselling it. There's a risk also that if you put a lot of emphasis on the circular economy and the market opportunities of sanitation, then you give an excuse for public investment to focus on other aspects, because this is like self-sustained. So don't oversell, be aware of community priorities, and make it part of a wide sanitation push. So yeah, we're promoting the circular economy, we're promoting reuse, but we're also taking care of the people that don't have access, or and trying to close those gaps. Fifth, these reuse efforts need to be well grounded on the economic, social, and cultural context. So that's looking at farmers' practices. Will they reuse or fertilizer or not? Is there competition from other reuse products like chemical fertilizer that tend to be subsidized? What perceptions around waste and reuse might hold back my efforts? And yeah, you can either try to address some of those issues or try to adapt what you are proposing to work within those conditions. And finally, reforming policy. And I frame that as creating positive incentives for safely managed sanitation and for reuse, but also removing barriers that so that overall you create an enabling environment for sanitation, for on-site sanitation in particular, which we know is lacking, and for reuse. And that's again about policies, regulation, coordination mechanisms, accountability channels, etc. But again, you can have more details in the policy brief, but just to give a taste, and then I'll move to the panel.
Thank you, Andres. Thank you, Lila. That was really interesting. So brown gold. When you say gold and then you say we don't want to oversell it, maybe it's brown silver. I mean, there are lots of issues embedded in that challenge of moving from what is regarded or seen as a waste product to something that's valuable. And I notice in your writings you talk about value chains quite a lot, which is an important shift in the sanitation sector. So let's turn to the panel now, this illustrious panel. I want to start with Mariam. I have a couple of questions for you. The first is, well, okay, change is what's required, right? But financing is absolutely essential to making change happen and to ensure a sustainable kind of change. What insights can you bring from your research on managing the challenge of financing sanitation delivery? That's my first question, and I have a follow-up. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Alan. I think my input is very similar to what Andreas was talking about when we think of off-grid sanitation and the challenges that comes with it. And therefore we start thinking about innovation in technology and in business models to make sure that we have sustainable. Yeah. Sorry. So I was saying that when we think about off-grid sanitation, we often go to think about innovation and sort of what type of technologies fit informal settlements or busy urban areas, and therefore we start thinking about technology or business models, public-private partnerships, and etc. And when we do this, we sort of just dive in what we think will work, and like container-based sanitation or market-based business models in order to make it accessible to people, just because we can't have sewer-based sanitation. And doing this means that we sell these ideas to people, to governments, to NGOs, to donors, to try and see how it will work. But then we forget what are the type of social norms of governments' positions on who should pay for sanitation. And I did my PhD in basically understanding incentives of people who think they should pay. And I did compare regions like South Africa and Kenya. And it's a completely different story for the same technology, container-based sanitation. South Africa, all the apartheid legacy has made people believe or trust that this is their human right and that they shouldn't be paying for it. So container-based sanitation is not for market in South Africa, but the government is willing to pay for it to serve it for free for people. Then you go to Kenya, to Nairobi, and there are so many NGOs or social enterprises, they call themselves, and they push the container-based sanitation on the basis that people don't have proper sanitation, so they will be interested to pay for us. Even we can subsidize it because we have big philanthropies who want to do that, and then they reach the ending when they realize that people cannot actually afford to pay it, and therefore the financial sustainability of that business model is zero, because the philanthropies will not be there forever. And we can see from Bill and Melinda Gates' new move that we don't want to invest in random socially interesting topics. We want a cool toilet. So funding will eventually go from philanthropy. So we only have the government, but the government in Kenya and in so many countries are not interested in off-grid sanitation, container-based sanitation, because we have banks, World Bank, IMF, all those big financial institutions who are not interested in anything beyond big infrastructure. Yesterday, I was in a nature-based solution workshop, and we had European investment banks sitting there and basically being very frank and very honest and saying, well, it has so many financial risks. We can't go with nature-based solutions because it's not big infrastructure that financiers are willing to risk their money there. So designing the bottom line of what I'm trying to say is designing any technology, any market, any business model needs to make sure that we understand people's incentives, governance incentives, so that the overall long-term solution is working. And I would eventually just talk a little bit about sanitation workers, because I believe that they are one of the main groups that are stuck with our narrative around innovation. We keep producing new technologies to help them, but eventually we destroy their livelihood. We've seen people who, I did research with people in Bangladesh, and they don't want to do vacuum tankers because basically they are getting less money out of it, and the overall well-being and security that we keep talking about using technology is non-existent because the system is not willing to pay them what they are actually doing. So yeah,
So they
balancing.
they essentially bear all the risk as well,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
I have a follow-up question, which is kind of related a little bit to that point you made about Tigray. You know, sanitation doesn't just exist in sort of safe and secure environments, but also in humanitarian contexts. And increasingly we're seeing, you know, I made a slight joke about Khartoum, but I mean, Khartoum is seeing its own sanitation system decimated at the moment because it's in the middle of a war. It's a huge city in Africa. There are other parts of Africa, other parts of the Middle East as well, that have also seen major conflict decimate sanitation, not just because they've been involved in major battles, but they've been deliberately targeted in some cases, sanitation systems. So I wonder, Mariam, because you know you've got experience in Gaza, and the Gaza situation is terrible, but pre the war it was even pretty bad. What can you say about the challenges of doing this right in humanitarian context?
Thank you, Alan. Yes, I'm from Gaza, so I don't have experience. I lived it. So yeah, before the war, which happens usually very frequently, this time it's intense, but it happens almost every 2 or 3 years. And before that, you would be surprised to know that there's a huge high coverage of sewer-based sanitation. We had a very good working system until you reach the wastewater treatment element. So the end of the value chain was the issue. But the sewer-based sanitation used to work just fine until Israel comes and bombs 1 or 2 streets or a whole neighborhood. So that was one issue, which is the bombing of infrastructure. The other issue is the politics and the governance issues, which one of them is internal division, which we can acknowledge between different political parties. But most importantly is the 17 years of blockage, which is from Israel and sadly the Egyptian government as well. This had led to a very long-term failure of basic infrastructure in general. We have treatment plants that I did evaluation studies for that they did not work because simply there were no spare parts or they were just very close to the borders. We needed permits from the Israeli government to actually access the location. So the Israeli government is controlling what's happening in general. And one last thing would be interesting is when I did a study in Gaza to understand where money goes and how incentives are associated with the funding. And the key interesting thing was that most donors are interested to fund wastewater treatment plants because they are big. As we talked, they are great infrastructure, but not just because of that, but because we share the same cost. We live next to our occupier, and therefore, when we don't have energy to operate these treatment plants, or when they fail, all the raw wastewater goes directly to the sea, and therefore transfers to them. So the environmental and the shared environment sadly made it interesting for development banks, World Bank, the French, the Germans to just bomb lots of money there. But then again, go back to the finance, they think that Palestinians should manage to make it financially viable. But how, when we don't have any exports, any economic relationship with the outer world? So a mix of technical and political.
Yes, politics intrudes all the way, all along the value chain. Now turning to Paul, after nearly 3 decades, I'll say that again, 3 decades in the water sector. What stands out for you amongst the findings of this project? You know, what do you think is the greatest challenge in taking forward these recommendations, these 6 recommendations, particularly this notion of circular economy? It's very much in vogue. It's one of those development concepts that people love to use. But as we've heard, you know, there are challenges. Expectation levels are high. It's easy to spin and it's difficult to deliver. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, let's start with congratulating the authors of the report. It's very useful, very, very timely. I'd love actually to see some of the sorry. I'd love to see some of the additional information, I think, which hasn't yet been published, like some of the financial data from the different sites would be really, really interesting. But a good congratulations to the report. I think, as I said, very, very interesting. The things which stand out for me, the first thing is, well, firstly, it's about sanitation. 3 decades ago, it wouldn't have been about sanitation. It would have been about water supply. The second thing is that the focus on circular economy is more than a development vogue thing, in the same way that the focus on safely managed sanitation is not a vogue. There is plenty of evidence out there that tells us that if you're going to secure the health benefits and other benefits of sanitation, we have to aim for higher levels of service. And in the context of sanitation, that means looking after your brown gold after you've gone to have a crap. Yeah. The third thing which stands out to me is that this builds on, well, there's many things which stand out, but there's another one. We shouldn't forget the white silver along with the brown gold. If you're a farmer, you might be more interested in the nitrogen content of urine than the soil conditioning aspects of the solid waste as well. So let's not forget that entirely. But taking this holistic approach is really useful, in particular because it identifies this financial gap. Now, if we can, we need to quantify that gap as well. And that's why I'm interested to see the financial data. When I say we, I'll come back to that in possibly a second question that I'm going to be asked in a few minutes' time. It's really interesting and important to get into the details of that, because what it tells us is that even if we focus on, for example, peri-urban sanitation or whatever, we're going to have to cast our eyes wide of that to look for a holistic solution, including a financial solution to it as well. That applies in all contexts and in all countries, including the UK, to be perfectly honest. Yeah. So we need to take this broader approach, the multidisciplinary approach that you referred to. In fact, it resonates not just with the research, but with the answers to the questions that the researchers posed.
Great. Now, the second question indeed is about the role that FCDO can play in supporting these processes and taking forward these agendas. Other examples of success you can point to and sort of ways of doing it effectively, ways of driving the political message and other messages?
Yeah. So I'll try and answer that from the perspective of our new government, which makes it more, it's more useful in that respect. But in fact, some of this sort of research was originally funded with the support of SCDO or DFID or whatever. I'm thinking, for example, of Sanity's work in some of the urban slums in Kenya, which also have come up with similar messages, in particular this financial gap. That will continue. And I was speaking to our water research advisor just yesterday morning, and she's busy preparing new funding streams we hope to get approved in the not too distant future. But the situation has changed, actually, and this is quite clear if you look at our Foreign Secretary's new priorities. It's kind of, in the past, we have done development to people. I think everyone here is probably guilty of that, maybe with some exceptions. Yeah, we need to listen to the governments and support them. Now, you asked me about UK policy. Well, that actually has got huge implications for UK policy. Now, how can this manifest? I was looking at a presidential compact which has been drafted by the government of Malawi. Yeah. Now, clearly in Malawi, you're thinking, yeah, that's going to focus on rural water supply. There is a very major focus in that on urban sanitation. And that sanitation is safely managed sanitation. And it is linked to, for example, the establishment of an independent regulator. Now that's still draft here, yeah, and we're very interested to see how that progresses. Yeah. This is the sort of initiative that we need to be supporting in SCDO development policy. Yeah. Obviously, there are things that we would like to kind of see, and of course, many of those we can see in these sorts of initiatives. I'll just give you some examples. Firstly, inclusion, something that you mentioned as well. Yeah, really, really important. It's all very well talking about a whole systems approach. Well, what about those who are most marginalized? Are they going to benefit or are they going to be left out? The second one is climate. Interestingly, the Foreign Secretary also talks about the importance of climate and nature. You could easily take this report and see it through the implications for climate and nature. For example, brown gold. If brown gold is replacing organic fertilizers, chemical fertilizers, whatever, that has potentially an enormous impact on climate change and carbon emissions. Yep. So we have to look at it from that phase. The nature aspect, which the Foreign Secretary also talked about, if you dump excreta into a river or into another watercourse or the sea of Gaza, for example, that has major environmental implications which affect ecosystems, biodiversity, and nature. So we can see it from that perspective as well. One of my jobs is going to be to translate this sort of evidence, this paper, into terms which really kind of focus on its significance for UK development strategy. So that's what I'll be doing. Thanks very much.
And so all those connections you make, or you can see in the paper,
Yes.
are really critical. Agriculture, sanitation, health.
Food security.
Food security.
It goes well beyond the actually it goes beyond what is written in the paper, but I can see them and they're very stark and very clear.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Okay, turning to our third panelist, Sam. Regulation you've heard mentioned here, and getting regulations into the public domain and enforcing them. Easy to have paper regulations, enforcing them is hard. Can be critical to this whole nature of more inclusive sanitation. What experience can you bring from WASUP's work in Africa and Asia on that?
Yeah, thank you, Alan. So first of all, I just want to give an apology to everyone because I think I caused the session to be 5 minutes late because I got lost in Canada Square. So it was a comedy of errors, but some learning from me there. Anyway, my apologies. So just to preface response to that question by also congratulating the research team and the recommendation that really stands out to me, and I think this was also Andre's framing, is around the circular economy and being careful not to present that as a panacea and being realistic that the treatment of fecal sludge, for example, so reuse can cover a portion of the treatment costs. It doesn't turn it into necessarily a market-based solution unless there's a lot of wider work that takes place. So I think that's a really welcome intervention. In terms of regulation, I know first of all I'd situate this within circular economy within wider aspects of system strengthening. So really to enable circular economy to flourish, there needs to be action across policy, institutions, regulation, and financing. So there needs to be specific policy changes you mentioned to support entrepreneurs to invest in circular economy approaches, encourage uptake of reused products. We've heard both Paul and Mariam talk about container-based sanitation, and still in most countries, container-based sanitation is not recognised as a formal option. And that has an implication, and I mentioned that not only for circular economy, but as a way to improve access, context-specific solution in many densely populated low-income areas. So there are those policy measures that need to be addressed. There also needs to be a wide range of capacity development activities to support institutions. So come onto that institutional aspect, both preparing them for a future of multiple revenue streams and how do utilities engage in circular economy, but also understanding in terms of climate resilient sanitation, inclusive sanitation more broadly, the range of solutions that go into citywide inclusive sanitation. But now come on to regulation. So what I want to emphasize really is from WASUP's vantage point, and I'm speaking from a particular vantage point. So WASUP works in 6 countries in Africa and Asia. We happen to work in 3 countries in Eastern and Southern Africa with 3, who I would say are relatively high capacity water and sanitation regulators. Those include WASREB in Kenya, NWASCO in Zambia, ALRO in Mozambique, and we've really seen firsthand the impact that those regulators are having in driving processes of sector coordination, driving processes of sector reform. And we're in, I think, somewhat of a moment for regulation. As a global wash sector, there was a recent call to action that launched at the IWA Congress around regulation. And it's not just in Eastern and Southern Africa. We're seeing countries like Nepal establishing autonomous regulators or on track to do that, Latin America, and regional associations like ADARASA in Latin America and SOAS in Eastern and Southern Africa. So that to me gives me a lot of cause for optimism, because regulation is moving forward. It hasn't always yet translated into improved service outcomes. There are examples like WASREB in Kenya. I think some of the interventions they've driven forward to promote equity absolutely have resulted in increased access in informal urban areas. But in other cases, there's a lot more work to do. And there's a need for step-by-step guidance. And I'll just give a shout out to a roadmap that WHO will be releasing in the next 2 months or so. SOS and WhatsApp and UNICEF have been working with them on that, which sets out actually what is required for countries with limited resources to drive forward regulation in sanitation specifically.
Quick question, why is there a moment for regulation? What's given us this moment, you think?
So again, from my, I mean, it always involves some degree of political will and political emphasis, of course. Again, I'm speaking from my particular vantage point within the sector, but I think SOS in Eastern and Southern Africa, the Regional Association of Water and Sanitation Regulators, have had a tremendous impact in bringing together the regulators in the region, and actually now looking to go continent-wide, reaching out to countries that don't yet have autonomous regulators or have other regulatory models, and of course there are alternative models. You have ADARASA, you have institutions like World Bank. World Bank, often sometimes gets critiqued for an infrastructure focus, but the global water practice within World Bank actually is very keen on regulation and understands the importance of that, and sees that as central to its PIRF work. You have, as I say, ADARASA, the Gates Foundation previously, obviously now looking like they may transition away from that systems focus. There's been a lot of work at the sector level from those institutions, and I'm sure there are some I haven't mentioned who are driving this forward, and we really need to continue that emphasis.
Excellent. Second question is around this formal informal sort of dichotomy or binary, which is slightly artificial probably. But do you think environments are changing around this sort of inclusion of the informal sector, if you can call it a sector, in terms of this notion of more inclusive sanitation planning, for example? That's one of your key points, isn't it? Is to sort of bring in the whole of the sanitation environment into planning processes. Is that a reality? I mean, are we at another moment of change?
I mean, I think less so, but maybe moving forward. So there, we have three aspects I mentioned around inclusion and planning. So one is increasing recognition of the need to integrate urban sanitation planning with wider urban development. Again, there are actors that are really pushing forward the requirement for that, but the examples still are relatively few. There are some. So to give you two, Mukuru, which is a special planning area, was designated as a special planning area by the Kenyan government. It's a slum in Nairobi, and there's been a huge integrated slum upgrading program there, which has included sanitation and included context-specific solutions. So simplified sewers integrated within that overall program. So that's one point, is there's a lot more work to do in terms of integrating sanitation with wider urban planning. The second aspect is around inclusive mandates. So if we're going to look at what inclusion involves in practice in serving particularly slum areas, low-income urban areas, the first step, and I think Andrea's mentioned clarity of roles and responsibilities, there needs to be a service authority with a clear mandate to serve those areas. They might not do that directly, but they need to at least be coordinating services, working with the private sector. And that's where this kind of evolution in our understanding of formal and informal, I think, again, is relevant, because once you have clear mandates and a utility, say, that has responsibility for on-site sanitation, and this is a trend that's happening again in Eastern Southern Africa, Zambia, Kenya, we're seeing utilities previously responsible for sewage, now responsible for sewage and on-site. And that then creates an avenue to engage informal emptiers, who are informal pit emptiers, who are really providing the majority of emptying services currently. There's a lot of work that needs to happen to bring those into formalized structures, develop standard operating procedures, support emptier health and safety, develop contractual arrangements between the private sector and the utilities. So that's an aspect of formality that's moving forward, which is central to inclusion. And then the other aspect I briefly mentioned is community level engagement in sanitation planning processes. So speaking from WhatsApp's experience recently, and we'll be releasing findings over the next year or so. There was a study took place in Maputo looking at the impact of high quality shared sanitation on incidence of diarrheal disease and other health impacts. And that intervention has now shown significant impact on child stunting, which is really significant for the sector overall in terms of making a political case for investment in sanitation. But in our analysis, which is ongoing, but a key factor in that has been the involvement of devolved administrative structures in the group. So because it is quite a devolved local government structure. So you have borough chefs de borough, as they're called, who have really led their endorsement of these sanitation infrastructure improvements. And that's helped to build user engagement, it's helped to build operations and maintenance. So these facilities are now still in a very good condition because the community was engaged in the planning process from the outset, and that ultimately has contributed to the health impacts.
Very interesting. And I've heard mentioned, you mentioned politics, communities, action, high politics, community politics. I mean, politics is so central to this whole question. Big politics, geopolitics, I want to throw it open a bit now. So I'm going to invite actually anyone in the audience, but also the panelists, to answer this question if you can, which is around the politics of change. It's really, you talked about a political priority, making it a political priority, and that sanitation leaders, at least in my short career in this world, have been saying it's got to be a political priority for years, decades. There's been so much politics thrown at it, or attempted to be thrown at it, and yet the progress hasn't been so great. Is it the wrong kind of politics? Are we looking at the wrong politics here? Are we expecting grandstanding from leaders? Are we thinking the wrong kind of politics in order to achieve this kind of change that you've been talking about, whether it's regulatory or joining up the dots with agriculture? I mean, what kind of politics do we need? So that's a question for all of you. Lila, maybe you'd like to kick off with some thoughts.
Well, thank you very much for the great interventions. I guess, yes, we always talk about political will and politics. I would say it's at different levels. So, I mean, obviously, one level is at the national level, the linkages are not very clear. We've already heard from the panelists, finance ministries need to be aware that there's going to be increased disease burden. It's linked to education, gender equality, food security and nutrition, climate, disaster, ecosystem services. It's not just you're looking at the ship. So I guess, those linkages, the intersectoral linkages on the politics around the policy process. There's a lot of elite biases that we see across the board, and I mean, they need to be really tackled head on. We're always blaming the poor, we're blaming the people, they're not changing their behavior, they shit outside, they dump outside, etc., rather than looking at the wider context of lack of entitlements, deprivation. And you've also got to go beyond this behavior change business, because that's really been a problem in the sector. And again, really responsibilizing the very poor people rather than really tackling elite biases head on, because who is actually getting the infrastructure? People who have a voice. People who don't have the voice, are not going to get it. So I guess, yeah, that's a general problem. And in urban areas, there's a lot of local action everywhere, more maybe in rural than urban, but even in urban areas, lots of interesting community action. I mean, we see this Vijayatai here in Nanded, who did that action 10 years ago, just gone right now. But there are limits to what one community can do. So you need the co-production, you need the local government, you need buy-in from municipality, etc. So I think that's really important, particularly in the urban context. And finally, we have really wonderful international commitments. We have to take them seriously. The human rights are violated. So I guess really, creating accountability mechanisms when these violations take place. And also, I guess, as for the UK and other countries, keep up your development commitments. We've gone down. Where's the 0.7 come in? Money is not everything, but having a strong donor presence is really, really important. So I guess, the global community also has to step up. And finally, the Bill Gates of the world, they go from one fad to the other, but, we have to sustain commitment, even in shit.
Thank you, Lila. Other panelists, any thoughts on the politics of it all?
Well, it's hugely important, and I think that the sector needs to grow up in this respect to recognize the importance of politics at every level. To establish a regulator is not that simple. To get that health, to get your health, nutrition, food, and water sectors together is not simple. To understand and maybe influence the public perceptions is not simple. all of those actually need almost certainly some sort of political solution. Yeah, so it is actually really important. And for politicians, especially when you're listening to this, the thing is that if you could look at this from so many different angles. If we just take the economic angle, the economic costs of poor sanitation and its implications, not only for people's health, but for prosperity and for the economy, are hugely significant. You do not have to wait for the next outbreak of cholera for that to be demonstrated. It's already there in terms of the impacts of diarrheal disease and so many other conditions which are associated with poor sanitation and hygiene. Yeah. So yeah, I'm very glad now that the sector is changing in that respect. And it's interesting to reflect, and you'll probably reflect on, for example, Modi's influence in India. Yeah, and there's some interesting stuff, no doubt, to talk about that. But that has helped in some respects lead huge change, which has impacted on global sanitation coverage, not least sanitation coverage in India. Still, there's a way to go there. Yeah, but more people do use toilets now in India now than they used them before, and that I think is a step in the right direction, driven by politics. So that's what I'd like to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. We'll come back to Mariam and Sam in a minute, but I wanted to ask the audience, because I see some hands are popping up. If you have a question, if you don't mind standing up and just explaining who you are and then asking your question. Thank you. Go ahead, NC.
I'm NC Narayan from India. And, I want to talk about this politics of policy imagination also. And because of that policy imagination, where are the finances going also? There are allocations in the sector. Where is it going? I think, these are important things. This is nobody's fault that, the whole imagination grew out of a global modernity, environmental engineering, a specific approach of centralized sanitation. And that has actually worked here in a way. But that's also, there are limits to which there are energy, climate transitions. There are questions are being asked. Yesterday we saw, those plants being biomethanation and energy being produced also. So there are kind of good things also happening. But when you come to India, this kind of a policy imagination is actually getting very skewed. This kind of infrastructure, it's getting in our flagship programs, 2 or 3 cities can actually take away the whole allocation. And we have 6,000 to 7,000, small towns also, which actually needs these allocations. That is where, what you are telling about, the NBS and, all these kinds of, we can critique all that, but there is a lot needed to kind of work on that. So if these allocations, the politics of allocations are, addressed, we can actually kind of invest much more on this as a futuristic, and then the good thing is that, India only 30% we have, coverage. So rest 70% we have a scope to kind of go into leapfrog into climate resilient kind of technology. So this politics of imagination, first thing to be addressed, last point is that first thing to be addressed is to international financial institutions. World Bank has come out with something called the service level benchmarks, where your benchmark is to get into STP. So your financial allocations to state governments will come only if that technology is there. Otherwise, you won't get those allocations. So I think IFIs are the kind of major issue. So if this is a global forum, if we can kind of address them about the policy imagination that they have, but then it's tied to the kind of interest that you're talking about, the political economy of infrastructure building also.
Thank you, NC. Thank you. Very interesting. Policy, imagination, and thinking of the arts part of your project and how important it's been. Yes, madam, and then we'll come to you. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jen. I work for C40 Cities, but I used to work for So I am from South Africa, and I've done some research looking at urban sanitation, planning and provision in informal settlements in South Africa. And it is so politicized. South Africa obviously has this deeply entrenched history with apartheid, and obviously it's only been 30 years, but still it's been 30 years and still very little has changed. But on paper, they have fantastic policies, even for provision in informal settlements. but it doesn't matter what, who's supposed to get what. It is, what I found is that it's always whoever is shouting the loudest or has access to, or, whatever community it is that has the energy to protest that day will then get the attention of the politicians. So it doesn't matter who's been without sanitation the longest. It really is who's shouting the loudest. And so it just keeps flip-flopping from, oh, suddenly all of our attention is on this one, and now, oh, but they're using poo to protest as well, which is, so poo itself in South Africa is so political, and we saw that in the Please Have Full protest and Roads Reform, all of that, the shit was used as protest. So it's a tricky one, and I don't really know what it is. I'm kind of thinking around, I made some recommendations, but they're all just kind of very, loose, and we need to involve the communities, but how is it really going to change when there are still so many people without access, when you've got this deep history of inequity and lack of access to services, and a kind of pretty corrupt government that has some good intentions but is still kind of stuck in that. Yeah.
Thank you.
What can we do?
Political histories, yeah, and we're all in them, including the UK's decision to privatise the water industry. So
Yes.
we'll take a few questions and we'll come back to the panel.
Okay, my name is François Riquet. I'm from the International Water Institute. I used to, and I do agree with you, Peter, that there's been a tremendous change since 30 years ago. I mean, it's so let's be positive as well. I mean, that's one of the things we can say. And if we look at the politics, I think, the politics are at every level. At the community level, you've got the city level, you've got the national and international and continental level. I just take an example. Right now we are, the Africa Water Week is going to be very close now, and we have been discussing with AMCAR, and the AMCAR is starting to look at their new policy for the coming 5 years. And why is it interesting? Because actually the governments, they look at, sometimes they don't really know where to go, so they look for guidance. Certain ideas, we can do that and that. So in a way, even the continental vision is helping some of the countries to actually design, orient some of the activities. But you're right, maybe it will be not going anywhere. But still, the cities, these are the ones where, and I agree with you, I mean, the cities is where the change is happening. The cities will look also for, where should I go? And most of the time, they will look at what the ministry is saying or the sector is saying in the country. And then, of course, the communities at a certain level, they depend a little bit on what is going on, and they have to struggle by themselves. And I agree with you, shout and like this. But I noticed that the change factor in politics, having worked on the municipalities in Asia and Africa and Latin America, is really champions. We need some champions at a certain place. They can, and so it means really working, of course, look at the policy, look at the environment, look at intersectoral changes, the funding, benefits, economic benefits from engaging into sanitation. But with whom are you talking? So I really believe that at the same time, if we can get some of these champions at the municipal level, I say really very much, because they will really influence a lot of the planning, a lot of the budgeting. And then we can start moving things as well with community empowerment, engagement, etc. So I just want to come back with one more thing that you said, Andreas. I heard that you also were involved in CLTS, etc. So, for a certain number of years, you said CLTS is the panacea. Strangely, we don't speak so much about it anymore. So we've got a circular economy that is coming now to replace a little bit this new fashion, like we were saying. But still, it's a fantastic thing, circular economy. Even the European Parliament is really advocating for this, for European cities to actually engage more into a circular economy. But we know so little, and I was attracted to come because of the brown gold. And so what value, why do you give this value as gold There must be some kind of reason why you put it at this high level. You speak about reuse and environmental benefits, etc., etc. But and I will finish soon. In Sweden, where I was living too, I was so proud to be sitting on the bus because the bus is running on gas, and it uses the gas from all the waste, human waste, organic waste. And so I was saying, I contribute by my waste to this running of the bus. So energy is also something that I saw that mayors, wow, you talk to them about, you can produce energy with this, fantastic. So we need to talk the language that appeals to the local authorities as well.
Thank you, Francois. But so we have NC and the policy imaginaries. Yeah, we have the Jen and the politics of protest and change and the complexities there. We have Francois and leadership and what is this gold and how can it be, how can you get the gold from the ore, if you like, and turn it into something that's hugely game changing. But I want to put on notice that other members of the Brown Gold team, after we've done this round, I'm going to come to you. So put your hands up and be prepared. Mariam and Sam, can I start with you guys? Do you want to give your responses to those thoughts and comments?
Yes, sure. When you asked the question, I wrote visibility, and when the lady from South Africa mentioned that, and I think visibility is the tool in politics, and we've seen it here in the UK, the Thames running with all our lovely human waste, as they said. Those are the things that drive change. Now newspapers are interested to write about it every single day. People want to talk about it. There are commissions about water and water quality in the UK and what happens with the treatment plants there. Same things happen in South Africa. I've heard terrible stories about people burning themselves or putting who in the public space just to protest, just because of the visibility, which is very important. But then if this visibility is not followed by accountability, as Lila said, it all goes to waste. It's just doesn't sustain to the long term. And I think one key question about accountability is what are the solutions that we offer? Is it the root cause of the issue, or is it the symptoms? We keep talking about off-grid sanitation, but we forget that it's completely related to land tenure and informality. So we keep just putting money, just pumping money there to solve the issue, which is originally land tenure, then you're just wasting money without solving the actual issue. So accountability to make sure that we are dealing with the root cause. Same in Palestine, pushing money in Palestine will never solve anything. It's the root cause of occupation. It's the root cause of apartheid. It's in every region. In South Africa, apartheid is still there. When I went 2 years ago, I felt sad. I thought Palestine will be free one day. It will probably have very similar experience as slums in Cape Town, where the rich people live, but also the most discriminated people against are struggling. So it's what is the root cause that you are trying to solve instead of the symptoms of the issue.
Root cause is very important. Sam, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. So a few comments. I mean, first is just to reiterate, I think we've heard it through the comments so far, but this need for both top-down accountability, which is to add from a regulatory perspective, performance benchmarking with WSRC in Palestine. Many regulators have been doing that really effectively, as well as bottom-up accountability and citizen engagement. I think it was right to mention Swatch Bharat, and there are examples of those national level campaigns that we need to continue amplifying. Also the Nigeria, Clean Nigeria, One Wash in Ethiopia. So some of these national level politically driven programs have achieved results. In terms of what we can do, and I hear exactly what you're saying around just the immense politicization. So I want to offer three tangible actions, perhaps, that some in this room can continue to push forward. One is continuing to advocate for sanitation as a human right and embedding that within the constitution. And again, we've seen examples such as Kenya, often come back to Kenya, but it is an outstanding example in some of these systems level interventions where sanitation has been embedded as a human right in the constitution. That has led to a number of positive knock-on effects lower down the system. It really helps to provide legitimacy and momentum to wider activities. The second is continuing to connect sanitation with wider development. I think this applies both in urban and rural. So when we're looking at trying to create political momentum on this subject, yes, you need to continue to make the case for investment in sanitation, but you also need to make the practical case for integrating sanitation and not treating that as a standalone service. And to give again a really impressive example of this, when we look at citywide inclusive sanitation, there are a few examples still on the ground in low-income countries, but Malindi and Kisumu in Kenya are two examples where the county governments have led a process of intersectoral coordination. You have all of the relevant county government departments, whether that's health or transport or water and sanitation, collaborating in the development of these plans. So that's something that anyone involved in sanitation, I think, needs to continue to promote. And then the third point is building on Gwansa's comments around champions, of course, and it's champions don't fall off trees, and we continue to need to leverage those champions where they exist and really amplify their voice. And it's a point that's often made, but I do really believe in the potential of both peer-to-peer learning and amplifying case studies, success stories, the types of example that we see in this policy brief, because then you can really try to catalyze replication. And that's a role that certainly some of the actors in this room, I think, can continue to play.
Do you think the sector doesn't do enough broadcasting of success and good stories? Too much doom-laden doom-mongering about targets not being met? What do you think?
Is it my turn?
Well, no, you can interject.
Okay, I'll interject then. It's good to, you need both things, yeah. There are some really good examples that we could do much more with. I'll come back to that point. Equally, it's good that we have this element of that's not enough, which is evident in this room and in many other rooms as well. There's a problem though that we've got, which hasn't really been discussed. It's when we have political will, and it can be political will to imagine a situation beyond the immediate horizon. When we have good evidence of what could work, what we often lack is the ability to turn that into scale. So regulation is actually part of that solution. But I mean, from a UK government perspective, I think one of the things we need to do is to work with governments to take a decent idea, which probably has already been demonstrated, and work with a government or a municipality to take it to scale where it can make a significant difference. And that's a bottleneck at the moment. And I've seen it so many different times in both in water supply and in sanitation. And I think there is something that we need to address. And of course, when you say we, it is much better if we address this collectively. And you talked about donor in the single, it should be donors and development partners in plural, because by doing that, by collaboration with the government, with any government, it can be so much more effective than just yet another donor baby or yet another development partner idea or whatever. So that would be helpful. Yeah, collective action to resolve this.
Andres, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, one thing to respond first to the point of brown gold or not brown gold. I think my personal take on this buzzwords that emerge, like that suddenly everything is about nature-based solutions or about sanitation, circular economy, etc. To me, I try to take a very pragmatic stance, and to me, brown gold or the circular sanitation economy, it can be useful, but it can also it can be counterproductive. If you look at sanitation, the brown gold is the fact that the public health gains that you get if you have proper sanitation, but that doesn't seem to resonate for some reason to drive action. So if now we can call it brown gold and focus on reuse and then get a lot of traction, then let's use that term. I think the risk is, in this case, is that it can have unintended consequences, like by exaggerating the gains that you can get, you can undermine the case for public finance. And I think that's a big risk, and that's why with this idea of the circular sanitation economy and how it has been portrayed. I think it's also like some of actors in the sector have talked about trillions and have framed it from a very market-driven perspective. And I think that's the risk. So that's why maybe when I'm presenting it, I'm like quite cautious or critical in terms of the need to not oversell. So in a particular context, you can use it to get the attention of the politician and create incentives to what you need to achieve, then definitely let's use it. But if then you are moving from Sweden, where it can create that and it makes sense, to a country where actually what needs is just the government to take responsibility and put some money behind sanitation, then it can be counterproductive. Yeah, that's my reflection on the idea of brown gold. I think in terms of the political will,
Sure.
yeah, in terms of the political will and the political push, I think a key part is as a sector, we've been focusing a lot on some key aspects of sanitation, or more on some key aspects of sanitation, and not managed to do the politics aspect as well. And I agree there's been quite a lot of progress in recent years, and we can learn from those examples. And to me, there are three things that are really important. There's the demand, that people really wanting to move forward in terms of the sanitation services they have. And it can be a latent demand that is not very expressed, but that you can stir it. And there's been a lot of work on that through behavior change campaigns and so on. There is the political push, having the champions, having the finances, creating the right incentives in the government machinery to deliver it, and really following up, recognizing how problem the issue is. And then having the systems, good enough systems to start delivering, and then building that delivery. And that's around policies, around regulation, capacity, having existing examples of how it can be done at scale, having TA, having support for innovation. And I think from the three aspects, the one that we have been worst at is the political push, and being there to support the champions, to nurture the champions, really understand some of the incentives and working around those incentives. So I think as a sector, we need to, we are quite comfortable in the piloting and service delivery and saying like, now the government should scale this up. But have we really looked at the politics and worked on that? I think that's
And the incentive structures for politicians, no less.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andres. Seema, you wanted to
Yes.
interject, please introduce yourself. And
Seema Kulkarni, and I'm from Maharashtra, India, where we did the Bartlett study. This was basically a post sort of analysis also of the community-led local sanitation program. And my question really is about trying to understand how in the global policy space, whether it is governments or bilateral agencies, donors, what is the broader thinking in the context of the non-networked? Because I think, Brown Gold tried to bring in that element, whether that creates a space for any new imaginations. But my question really is, even in a country like India, we're talking about more than 60%, which is non-networked. So really, is it seen as an opportune moment for the private players to really come in? Is the state receding, or is there a commitment for governments to say, this is the time to step in, take action, and where the state makes solid investments into bringing the sanitation into a networked kind of so what is the politics here? Really, are you looking at the non-networked spaces as opportunities for private players or on housing? So that's one question. And just one more, because I think this study, Brown Gold, also tried to bring in the marginality lens. And here we were looking at sanitation workers, the entire informal, invisible workers who are actually taking on the burden because infrastructure simply doesn't exist, or Mariam, what you said really is, very stark. So what really is the robust policy statement in the context of marginality, especially when it comes to women and the other marginalized? So that's those two.
thank you, Seema. And any other interjections from the team? Yes, go ahead, Robert.
Thank you. I'm Prabha Patel from Nepal. I was part of the team. What I found when I was doing this research was we completely forgot about the interface between people and the infrastructure. We just jumped to infrastructure. If we have infrastructure, everything is okay. But we found in Nepal that infrastructure doesn't work when people do not want it or when there is no need for it. There are infrastructure which are underused. And another thing I found was waste. If we think about circularity, then we have to combine waste with the fecal salts. Only fecal salts or waste is a problem, fecal salts is a problem, will not work. And there should be some more liberate or some more close priority on involvement rather than participation for the people, because we have been talking about participation, that's not sufficient now. That was sufficient at one level where we were talking about CLTS, and that level we have crossed. Now we have to talk or we have to design active participation, not active involvement, not participation. So what will be the international or the national thinking about it goes, that's.
Thank you, Prabha. We have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to give the panel literally, yeah, I'm going to, well, okay, very quickly, very briefly, please.
Yeah, so thank you so much. My name is Patrick Rono, work with IWA. So my question is moving forward in terms of bridging the gap between research and practice. For example, for this case, this particular wonderful research. So how are your strategies in terms of now getting these findings to who actually like this kind of practitioners in India and Ethiopia, as well as other countries that need the findings from this particular research. So are there like any what next?
Very good question towards the end of the meeting. Deepa, 2 seconds.
I'm Deepa Joshi. I'm from Sri Lanka, the International Water Management Institute. Maybe I want to partly answer Seema's question. I feel this is not a question we should ask. I think the problem is that we've been asking such questions to a very centralized, far away, removed political audience or group that does not really understand ground realities. So I think sanitation is a classic example of the good intentions of development having gone wrong, right? So we have all the interventions and investments in technology, design options, finances, etc., which have really not solved the crisis today. And I think Brown Gold project really reveals that perhaps the way forward is through, as NC pointed out, politics of reimagining very contextual solutions to very contextual local problems. And I think this is what, this is a space, I think, that a growing number of actors, including entrepreneurs, and also sort of rethinking education, sanitation education, very centralized education. I think it calls for a rethinking of all of these approaches and really not looking into a global audience, a technical expert audience or a financial audience, as is increasingly the case, to tell us what the solution should be.
Thank you, Deepa. And I saw, Amita, your hand was up very briefly.
Yeah.
And it came down, but go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really interesting is that the whole prediction for lots of aspects of marginality. And marginality inclusion is not new in the world. It's not new in the sanitation sector. But it is new when we think about the service providers. But this is how do we actually look at inclusion and identity among the workers? Yeah, how do we treat issues of gender and disability, for example, take for example injured or people who are manual pittance that get injured in the line of duty? How do we bring them into the debate?
Thank you. Very important issues of marginality and inclusion and identity and disability, which are critical. I'm going to hand over to the panel, but I'll ask you to be extremely brief because we'll run over otherwise. So there are several questions. We had, the question of infrastructure, Patrick. making a very important point. Deepa was answering almost Seema's question there. Politics of imaginaries have come back in again, thinking, imagination, political imagination, if you like. So, you know, and whose gold? In fact, you know, if you're talking about gold, you're encouraging people to seek gold, right? And so, who seeks the gold? Is it the right people, or is it an inequitable seeking of gold that will go on? So, how do you make circular economy equitable at the same time as profitable? Analysts, over to you very quickly.
I think it's a question of what policies we are injecting, and then what are the tools that we need, which are mostly the gap in financing and then other issues. So I think the question about what the international community wants, I honestly don't know, because we see city-wide inclusive sanitation and everyone was like, yeah, now we acknowledge off-grid sanitation, but then we go back, financial institutions, governments are stuck with financial institutions, so they just follow because they need the money, sadly, and everyone does this. So the conflict between policy, which should fit the context, comes with, just facing the issue of very orthodox financial institutions and governments who are not willing to make that shift, which is necessary from different financial and packages that fit context. Sanitation workers, for example, they've been WaterAid did lots of great work to support the part which relates to visibility. Some other organizations like SNV did lots of capacity building to help them access financing, which could potentially improve their livelihoods. But then we face the issue, we have very orthodox institutions who are not willing to actually move that step needed in order to work with sanitation workers, just because they are not the traditional safe option that they have. So yeah, bridging the gap between those two, I think, is the main question. Very other interesting question.
Very quickly.
So yeah, I don't think others could
Okay.
contribute
Thank
more.
you. Sam, your final thought.
Thank you. So I think these relate. Seema, I think, that asked the question around the global status of non-network sanitation. So there are just two comments there. I mean, one is, I think you were asking around the role of the private sector. And the first thing I'd say is sometimes it is presented as a false dichotomy between the public and the private sector. And in urban contexts, it's very much around connecting the two. And that leads into this question of formalization of informal manual emptiers as well. So that's increasingly where certainly my organization, What's Up, is focusing, and others, how to bring the private sector into formalized structures and connect them with utilities and utility-led contexts for municipalities and local governments. And then the second point is, we talked about whether we have the right balance between optimism and emphasizing everything that needs to be done. And I'd just close by saying that I think there is a window of opportunity at the moment, and this again is from a kind of global vantage point, looking at kind of global research studies. It's striking that there are a number of countries, both across Africa, and we have the ASPG, the Africa Sanitation Policy Guidelines, to anchor that, and in other regions, who are right now revising policy frameworks, regulatory frameworks around sanitation. Because sanitation overall is underdeveloped in many low-income countries, and those policy and regulatory frameworks in some cases don't really exist, but they are now being developed in many cases. So that presents an opportunity to integrate from the outset some of these circular economy principles, for example, rather than a larger piece of work around retrofitting them in 10 years' time. So we need to seize on those processes of revision where they're happening.
Preparing the groundwork, if you like. Yes. Thank you very much, Paul.
Okay, so very briefly,
Sam, Paul, back to you.
the system, yes. Everyone should be part of a system. Everyone should be part of a system. That system doesn't have to be a connection physically to infrastructure, but even if you're using off-site sanitation or indeed off-site water supply, it still needs to be part of the system, and we need to all internalize really what that means. And part of that system is the ability to communicate your views if you are a consumer, a user, or whatever, especially if you're marginalized. And that's what we're also lacking. Responding to Deepa's point about where really is the expertise we need, and it is down there, but we need a system to be able to listen to it, and we have to be prepared to listen to it. So that's my answer to those two questions. I'd just like to say, maybe as the last panelist here, to thank you very much for setting up this event, for causing us to come together to talk about these issues. It's a really, really useful report, very timely, and we will be, certainly I will be taking it out We have work. So thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Finally, Lila and Andres.
I think, I mean, there are so many really interesting points and questions. It's a bit difficult to pick one, but I think two of the issue of sanitation workers that has been highlighted, I think is one that is a good example of a topic that should be central to, not necessarily central, but integrated in the conversations on sanitation, and that is missing. And I think we need to sort of try to make sure we reach a situation in which it doesn't have to be highlighted. Okay, there's this sanitation project and the issue of sanitation workers are going to happen. Similarly with on-site and off-site, we were having a discussion because we were thinking like, okay, we need to make the point of on-site sanitation more clearly. And I was like, but we already know that, like, we need to discuss it again. But then you look at the numbers of what's happening in practice in the sector, and yeah, it's a message that needs to be reinforced. And I think, yeah, we need to keep pushing on those topics so that they become like the normal ways of doing sanitation. And yeah, I think we sometimes don't make use of some of the evidence that is out there. Like, for instance, on the topic of on-site sanitation, we don't have really good estimates of how much is going to each of the sewer sanitation as compared to non-sewer sanitation. But we know that more than half of the population is now being with toilets is now being served by on-site rather than sewer sanitation. But when you look at the global aid flows, twice, so the amount that goes for non-sewer sanitation is twice as much as what it's going to what they call basic sanitation, which is like rural and on-site. So even if we don't have very good evidence, there are some pieces of evidence that we can use to challenge some of the biases and some of the aspects that are neglected in the sector. So
thank you, Andreas. And finally, a couple of seconds from you, Lila, to close the
Very
meeting.
quick. No, you're going to close. So Patrick, thanks for that question. You know, we didn't have time to go into all the countries, but Sanjay sitting next to you can talk about what's happened in practice in Nepal, influence and policy. Our team is full of a lot of practitioners who actually have been taking this forward on the ground. So I would encourage you to look at the website, etc. You know, I mean, there are these high profile things like Swachh Bharat. Yes, of course, it's, you know, raised the profile, but there are questions around sustainability, equity, and what's happening. There's still a lot of open defecation still in India, and there's lack of data, transparency, and monitoring. So I think we also need that. And huge questions about accountability. CLTS, again, another high profile. I was part of one of the first studies on CLTS with Robert Chambers, and Kamalkar and Rohit here has worked for a long time on it. You know, there were lots of local champions there, but champions move on. So if you don't really build the structures, you don't really focus on the institutions, you don't focus on the co-production. And CLTS, like Swachh Bharat, like other things, also there were issues of sustainability and equity and inclusion. So I guess, you know, that is a lesson across the board. And South Africa, you know, shit is protests. That's really powerful. We've done work there on water, and you see wonderful policies, but, you know, what is actually happening on the ground? And partly it's also because so much is there at the national level, but then there's so much decentralization, and cash-strapped municipalities supposed to pick up the pieces. So a huge disjuncture there. And then the historical legacies of apartheid, of the caste system in India, of occupation. And unless we tackle these historical injustices, I don't think we're going to do it. So we have been trying to reimagine in this project. And that was also to reimagine shit as brown gold. And, you know, there's energy benefits, there's nutrients, but it's a very, very long process. And I think we're still getting there. So yeah, I think we have to keep up with the reimagination and just tackle the politics, the power, the inequality, the marginalization at all levels. And at the end of the day, donors have to work together. It's not just donor, but we are here in the UK. I pay my taxes in the UK. So I want the UK to be a champion in this. I think a lot of us in the room want that also. So that's why I flagged the UK. Anyway, thank you. It's been a great dialogue here. Thank you so much, all of you.